Tonight on Primetime Politics.
We need to continue to do everything we can to ensure that communities are safe.
Moving forward on the Mass Casualty Commission's final report. Nova Scotia's top RCMP officer discusses the call for major changes inside the force.
And I will be like a hawk on behalf of Canadians to make sure that this is happening.
Rogers has approval for its takeover of Shaw, but the federal government has laid out conditions. Our journalist panel weighs in on that and this week's budget. Plus,
this is nothing short of a political prosecution.
Donald Trump indicted. What does this mean for the former president and for Republicans? Journalist Dave Leventhal joins us later. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson, in for Michael Serapio. We begin with more on the Mass Casualty Commission, its review of how police handled the 2020 massacre in Nova Scotia, and its recommendations for a massive overhaul of the RCMP.
Among our recommendations, we are calling for major changes to RCMP oversight, processes, and culture.
It's imperative that police leaders get on board with making meaningful change and ensuring that they are engaging others in doing so. And so it's not a matter of can they must.
Improving the note-taking, improving the supervision, improving overall openness and transparency in how decisions are made, in direction between advisory bodies, police boards, and so on.
Well, let's talk more about what the commissioners are calling for. Dennis Daley is Assistant RCMP Commissioner and Commanding Officer in Nova Scotia, and he's in Halifax. Assistant Commissioner Daley, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to talk to your viewers.
You've now had the Commission's final report for 2 days, and of course, more than half of their recommendations involve the RCMP. What's your top priority in Nova Scotia as you go through the report?
As you know, the RCMP has significantly supported the independent Mass Casualty Commission. Yesterday was a very somber day. It was my first opportunity to spend time at the venue in Truro. I met with family members, also listened to the three commissioners deliver the public report. For the RCMP, we did not wait for the release of the report to action some change. Here in Nova Scotia specifically, we've added significant resources to our emergency response team. We have robust emergency alerting, public alerting protocols. In Nova Scotia since April of 2020, we have triggered 18 emergency alerts for critical incidences. In addition, we have updated mapping pictometry, which was an issue during the response. We have also rolled out new equipment such as what we refer to as Blue Force tracking, so we can now track our officers outside the police car more readily. It assists in command and control because our commanders now know where each responder is. So when our first responders responded and walked into the nightmare that was Portapic with the fires and multiple things going on at the same time, it was difficult for our commanders to know where our immediate action response teams were. So we've rolled out that sort of equipment as well. As far as top priorities, again, I've started reading the report. I'm going to have to give the report the due diligence, as the commissioner said, to read it appropriately and digest it. I do know the relationship. For me, one of the top priorities is the relationship with our policing partners, and not only our policing partners, but also our partners from community services and other services that we need to be successful. So I've already started that rebuilding and strengthening of the relationships with the Nova Scotia chiefs of police. I'm kind of lucky because this is my third time in Nova Scotia, so I have some pre-existing relationships that I'm able to build on. So I've met collectively with the chiefs of police, I've met individually with the chiefs of police, and I'm quite confident that the relationship will strengthen. Recognize, I think the Nova Scotia, I think Nova Scotians realize that we are integrated, we train together, and we do operate together. Though I do recognize that the need to strengthen the relationships at the more senior command.
Right, and I do want to ask, because you talked about some of the policies that you put in place recently, and I guess what Nova Scotians and Canadians want to know is are you confident that at this moment that those new policies would make the response substantially different than what happened 3 years ago?
I'm certainly confident of that the response would be significantly different. Even the single edition of emergency alerting now that the RCMP uses and other service providers, other police forces across the country use now is a significant step forward in being able to communicate effectively to the public during a critical incident. So we would have seen last summer at James Smith First Nation in Saskatchewan, where multiple alerts were put out over a period of time. And so, that I am confident just that in and of itself will be of assistance, let alone the other changes. However, I do want to also commit that there is more to do, and we are willing, not only in Nova Scotia, but as an RCMP organization, we are willing to commit to act on all the recommendations.
Right, and the Commission says that the RCMP needs to, in their words, adopt a policy of admitting its mistakes and being more accountable. So when it comes to the mass casualty in the report that's being put out, who is being held accountable for the mistakes that were made?
I certainly myself, recognize that our first responders and the support staff who responded to Portapique did the best they could, given their training and their equipment available at that particular time. However, I do acknowledge as well that there were shortcomings in the response. It is my responsibility as the leader here in Nova Scotia and other police leaders to review the report and act on those recommendations that specifically speak to police around the critical response.
I do want to ask you as well about officer training. The commissioners are calling for a new 3-year model which would replace the RCMP's long-standing training depot in Regina, where there's a 6-month program. What do you think of that idea?
I do think, as the commissioners talked about yesterday, is taking the time to review exactly that recommendation and other recommendations. I think it's too early to comment on the implications of such a decision. I am aware that it was discussed throughout the inquiry, and the suggestion of other countries who may have a system that might be more effective. So I do think it's too early to really comment on how we may move forward on that recommendation.
Well, then let me ask you about the urban-rural divide, because the Mass Casualty Commission did speak of that throughout its report in some of these issues. They want more community orientation, more supervision for officers in rural and remote detachments. How are you going to address that?
Yes, that's a challenge for us. As you know, we do primarily rural policing across the country. What I heard from the commissioners as well that I tuned into yesterday was the urban bias versus the rural bias, for instance. And, it's throughout my service, and I've done significant amount of rural policing, the access to services that assist the police in accomplishing goals can be reduced in the rural areas. And so that's always been a significant issue. For instance, I can recall, the courts asking for probation and along with anger management, for instance, and the challenge was that the course on anger management wasn't offered, or there wasn't enough participants in order to offer the course in the rural area that I was working in. So that is external to policing, but the idea of community well-being, community safety, and which the commissioners touched on significantly, is an important issue. I'm certainly supportive of anything that provides more public safety, recognizing that the commissioners also said that the police seem to be the default for a lot of different things where we do not hold the expertise. And I think every police leader would agree that we seem to be the default. So I do think we need further conversations. Police need to be part of those conversations as we reimagine what policing may look like.
All right, well, certainly, we could go much deeper into this report, but we do have to leave it there for now. Assistant Commissioner Dennis Daley, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
That was the RCMP's commander for Nova Scotia reacting to the final report from the Mass Casualty Commission. Commissioners were looking at the circumstances that led to the deaths of 22 people 3 years ago. Kim Stanton was one of those 3 commissioners, and I spoke with her on Thursday, shortly after the report was made public. Your report offers a very detailed timeline on those terrible 13 hours in April of 2020, and it flags numerous police failings and even a lack of some basic policing techniques, things like knowing the terrain, alerting the public, communicating among first responders. How much work does the RCMP face in order to be prepared with situations like this?
It does face some work, but it can be done. We set out a pathway for how the RCMP and any police agency can ensure that the pre-critical incident response planning and preparation is done and done well. We dedicate a whole section of our report to everyday policing and the ways in which basic policing tasks can be done better, and to set people up for the ability to have a critical incident response that is effective, that keeps police officers safe, and that helps keep community safe.
You are calling for some big changes for the RCMP and saying that Canadian society faces a reckoning on policing. So based on what you've seen and heard over this inquiry and since, how confident are you about these changes actually being put in place?
I think we're at a moment in Canadian society where people are really wanting to look at how we can be safer, how we can keep one another safer. We're also at a moment where we're really looking at how do we want police to do better and be a more cohesive part of our community safety and well-being. And I think people are ready for there to be change in how we go about that. And we talk about really looking at prevention first. So rather than getting to the point where we're enforcing the criminal law or responding to a critical incident, how do we prevent violence in the first place? And there are lots of ways in which we in our communities can start to do that one-on-one. And we think that the police also, we heard from members of the police who really want to do better as well, and we want to equip them to do better. So I think it's time.
Your report does acknowledge that there have been many previous calls for RCMP reform. So I'm curious, going through your recommendations, how many of your calls for action overlap with what we've seen at previous inquiries but just haven't been implemented yet?
One of the things that we did from the outset was in our mandate, we were asked to look at prior inquiries and reports that were relevant to our mandate. And we did an environmental scan of 2,000 recommendations from prior inquiries. And the way that we proceeded was to say, are these recommendations that have been made before, and if they have, why weren't they implemented, or are they new to this inquiry? And we have dedicated a volume of the report to implementation and identified some of the past barriers and suggested a way forward. And we suggested a mutual accountability body that would include members of the affected communities, of those most affected from the April 2020 mass casualty, from the police, from the federal and municipal and provincial governments, to hold one another to account and to report publicly on the progress of implementation.
All right, one item that you want to see progress on is a national review of public alert systems. So tell me what you want to see happen and how fast do you think changes can come?
Right. So it's apparent to us that there are improvements that can be made in terms of the public alerting system. And there is a review that's coming up in any event to public alerting with respect to the current partners that are there. And we say, take a look at the governance. Canada's unique in the world in that we have a private corporation that is essentially the governance party for our public alerting. And we believe that the federal government Ministry of Public Safety should really be in that role, and that there should be engagement with provincial and municipal partners and territorial and Indigenous partners in the alerting system. And we think it's actually very important that it happen soon.
Another element of your report looks at the urban-rural divide on some of these issues when it comes to policing, access to services, and you say rural Canadians, not just in Nova Scotia, but elsewhere across the country, aren't being as well served as they could be. Why is that, and how does that play into your report as you went back and looked at the events of 2020?
So one of the things that we focused on throughout the inquiry was the rural context in which this mass casualty occurred. And it's really important to take into account that context, because it's just the case that it's further between detachments. It's further in terms of response times for people living in rural and remote parts of the country. And that's a lot of Canada. And what we found in our review of policing and a number of the other aspects of our mandate is that policy is, generally speaking, designed for urban centers and not really taking into account the rural context. And we had a significant amount of information provided to us that really lays out how important it is for provinces and territories to take into consideration the needs, the resourcing needs in rural areas. There is a number of factors that cause there to be a different context for people living in rural areas, and it needs to be addressed.
All right, Commissioner Kim Stanton, there's a lot in this report to go over. Certainly we'll be looking at it in the coming days and weeks, not just today. So thank you for taking the time with me today.
We're so grateful that you took the time. Thanks so much. Take care.
Let's get more reaction to the Mass Casualty Commission report and what it says about gender-based violence and the safety of women. Erin Breen is a lawyer who represented several women's advocacy groups at the Commission. I also spoke with her on Thursday. Much of the report, and in fact more than half of today's recommendations, deal with policing, the RCMP specifically. So I want to start with your reaction to what the Commission says about the RCMP and gender-based violence, which was your focus in going before the Commission last year.
Yes, so our coalition was very much focused on the gender-based violence mandate of the Commission. And upon first glance, I haven't had much time to review the report as a whole. It's a very large report, 7 volumes, but I did scan through, in particular, the volume on violence where our contribution was focused. We are pleased, certainly, with the fact that our submissions before the Commission appear to have been received, taken seriously, and adopted into the report. So what we really pushed for is a move away from the carceral system as the default response to gender-based violence, because it is clear, and all of the experts certainly testified it's clear, it is not solving the problem. In fact, things are getting worse. We need a completely different approach. And that approach involves looking to the community and community-based organizations, corrections and police as being the center of the response. They continue to be a layer, not the default response. So I haven't had an opportunity to view in detail the policing volume, but certainly what I did see is that the Commission recognized that gender-based violence was not addressed anywhere adequately at any point in time by the RCMP over the course of the life of the perpetrator in this case, and that on numerous occasions, community members were aware of this, the police became aware of his violence, and he got a pass. So things desperately need to change, and I'm really looking forward to diving into that policing volume as well.
Right, and so let's talk about some of the other recommendations then that deal with gender violence, intimate partner violence, and family violence. You've talked about the police, but there's also the root causes of that violence and how that can be countered. What are some of the key items that you've seen in this report that you're looking at, that you're looking for governments to act on?
I think that the key issue here is the commissioners have equated the social determinants of health with social determinants of community safety. So they've recognized that when people are living in poverty, when people are living without adequate resources, in particular people who are in rural areas, and this puts them at an increased risk for experiencing gender-based violence. So it's what the Commission is urging is a public health response to what is an epidemic. And it has to be a full societal shift and with everyone on board. And you will see that this is not just directed at police or the justice system or corrections. This is directed at every office in Canada. It's directed in every workplace, in our school system, a full recommendation for early education, starting in kindergarten, going to grade 12, in how we as community members can react, can effectively conduct bystander intervention, all of these issues that clearly were a problem in this particular case.
I want to ask you as well about the shooter's common law spouse. The report does talk about Lisa Banfield saying she was not treated properly as a victim. Tell me why that is so important.
Well, it's so important because she was the first victim in the mass casualty. However, she was criminalized. She was charged criminally by the RCMP. She initially was interviewed and asked to provide information to help police, believing that she was assisting, that she was trying to assist everyone who had been harmed by him by giving the information that she had. Suddenly, the tables turned on her. RCMP ends up charging her. And from her own testimony, she said initially she received great support in the community. However, once she was charged criminally, she became a target of public scorn and hatred. So I think the Commission recognized this at an early stage, that she was demonized, and that we as a society have got to do better. We've got to educate ourselves, and this victim blaming that goes on cannot continue.
All right, we will have to leave it there. Obviously, a lot to process in today's report, not just what happened 3 years ago and before that, but also what's going to happen in the future. Erin Breen, thank you for your insight.
Thank you so much.
Let's stay on the Mass Casualty Commission and the future of the RCMP. Here to weigh in on that story and more are three journalists and three bureau chiefs here in Ottawa. Bob Fife of the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles of the Toronto Star, and Joanna Smith of the Canadian Press. Tonda, let me start with you. We've seen Thursday's final report pointing to RCMP failings before, during, and after the mass shooting in 2020. What do you make of the reaction we've heard from the RCMP since the report's been out?
I mean, even since the report's been out, the reaction continues to be sort of gobsmacking to me that the force is still not able to acknowledge its mistakes and apologize for the mistakes, instead saying that they did their best at the time and they've made changes since. Well, I think that this report is meant to signal all the other changes that need doing, and they had time to respond to it. They had time to digest it and read it. Even if the interim commissioner or the Nova Scotia chief didn't have time to actually read the thing, somebody should have been reading it overnight and briefing them and had a response that would deal with families' concerns and the public's concerns, and they didn't have that. So failure in communications, and that is more than just PR, that's a failure in policing.
Now, Bob, we've seen a lot of calls for the RCMP to reform itself over the years. The commissioners themselves even acknowledge that in the report. Why do we think this time is going to be different, or will it be any different this time?
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to be very different when you have families, tears rolling down their cheeks, the emotions of what they went through, and you have the acting deputy commissioner, Michel Duhem, says he hadn't even read the recommendations. I mean, get real. And this is the problem with this force. It is calcified, and somebody needs to really shake it up. This report is very far-reaching and makes a lot of really good recommendations, but it's not as if they haven't had these kind of recommendations before. One of the major problems is we've got to separate the RCMP into a separate FBI-type force, which has been recommended before, and the provincial police, the RCMP that do contract policing, need to be set up in a different format than we have with the RCMP as of right now. It's just too big and it's unmanageable, and people have complained that the detachment commanders in Nova Scotia will say, well, I only, when headquarters calls, well, I report to the provincial attorney general, and when the provincial attorney general has a problem with the RCMP, well, sorry, I report to headquarters. This is the kind of institutional problems at the RCMP, and there's a whole lot of others. I mean, what they talk about, the kind of training that is necessary. Wow, like they're right. 26 weeks of training when they should be doing what the Finnish model, which is 3 years. What kind of, look at the improvement you would have in a police force if that's the case, but money is the issue, right?
Okay, Joanna, let me bring you in here. What do you see in these recommendations that's catching your eye this week?
I think there was some really interesting specific recommendations on what the federal government could do about it. I mean, if we're in a situation where the RCMP cannot be expected to reform itself, there were some key recommendations for Ottawa. One of those was changing the way in the RCMP Act itself, putting more on guard for potential political interference. You remember the scandal last year when it sort of came out that Lucky had maybe let slip in a conversation. She was disappointed that something that she had promised political masters she would do, she was not doing. The report found, no political interference, ill-timed, not the best way to say things, but probably not partisan, but at the same time drawing a clearer line between the public safety minister, the RCP commissioner, maybe even removing in the act itself this part of the oath that says she serves at his direction or whatever it is, would clarify things a little bit. And then on gun control, I found it interesting that they recommended specifically to create an evergreen definition for a semi-automatic weapon, right? That is something Liberals tried to do in the amendment. They did it badly. There was a communications failure on their part. They've withdrawn the amendment, but that's something this inquiry is also recommending.
And it's still not clear if this government is committed to enshrining in law a definition around semi-assault style weapons, semi-automatic assault style weapons. They're struggling with it politically at the committee, so that's a big challenge for the government. But the RCMP and reform of the RCMP has been a long-standing issue, and I'm not sure this government is committed to do that either.
And we're also waiting for a new permanent RCMP commissioner to be named.
This is really, really important. They blew it to the last commissioner. Brenda Lucky was way out of depth. She was basically a mid-level RCMP officer, was in charge of the training facility in Regina, and moved into headquarters with no experience in Ottawa, not a lot of depth in terms of criminal investigations either, and she was just out of her depth. If you're going to have real change at the RCMP, they need to have somebody who doesn't meet the check marks that the Trudeau government has, but somebody who can meet check marks that Canadians need is somebody who's going to come in and actually reform the institution.
Okay, let's turn to a major decision affecting consumers that's in the news today, the federal approval of the 26 billion Rogers takeover of Shaw. And I should add, Rogers and Shaw are two of CPAC's founding members. So Shaw-owned Freedom Mobile will be transferred to Videotron as part of the deal. And the industry minister says he's imposed conditions to protect Canadians. I'll get all of you to react in a moment, but let's hear from François-Philippe Champagne.
I want to be clear with everyone that I will ensure that a new fourth national player can go toe-to-toe with the big three and actually drive down prices. These conditions and enforceable commitments should not be taken lightly. If I don't see lower prices in Canada, what I'm saying is that everything will be on the table, and I will then seek further powers in order to achieve that for Canadians.
So, Bobby, you were at this news conference. The industry minister says he's going to watch Rogers and Videotron like a hawk. What's your take?
Well, I mean, they had some pretty important conditions put in there, like they expect to see prices come down about 20%. There are some strong penalties for Videotron if they don't meet their conditions, and of up to $1 billion for Rogers if they don't meet their conditions. So this is in a way has been a change, because we don't normally see government being as strong with the telecoms who have a monopoly. But we've all been here before. We've all heard this before. The proof is in the pudding. Let's see the prices come down, because we'll all be saying, "Hey, Mr. Hawk, you said you were going to bring these things down." And forgive us if we are skeptical of this.
Right, and Joanna, that's been, of course, long-standing criticism here in Canada that we pay some of the highest rates in the world. The Competition Bureau raised this. The NDP is raising this. Other critics are raising this. How do you see this playing out politically for the government as they try to sell this to consumers?
I think it looks like a win for them, and it's sort of one of those, it wasn't a surprise today, but that's because a lot of this is really set in motion in the fall. So when Champagne rejected the original deal, that original deal was already pretty much dead in the water, right? And then he attached conditions that were already in the works. So here we are today. He gets to say, I've imposed, I've got concessions. It's technically true, but I think the proof will be in the pudding. The details of the price limitations, there's wiggle room in there. You can enforce a document, but if the terms are not clear-cut themselves, then lawyers will do their lawyer thing and fight them potentially. The other thing to consider is when you impose financial penalties on a business, makes sense, but a business is always going to decide what's more expensive to meet, paying the penalties or implementing these conditions.
And hitting consumers for the penalties.
Yeah, Tonda, what do you think? Because the minister is saying he's got the power to enforce these conditions. He's willing to actually take more action to reduce prices. He's saying he's willing to use whatever legislative or regulatory tool he has in his bag.
Right, and that's unclear. I mean, had they had regulatory tools they could have used earlier, we might have seen them use them, right, on big telecoms to control the consumer prices. But the fact is, no government really wants to be regulating prices and controlling the markets. And I think part of the bet this deal does is hope that in bringing a fourth player in, spreading its market out beyond Quebec into the West, they're hoping that prices generally will come down too. But that's also a wish and a prayer to a certain extent. But I think that it allows, to Joanna's point, it allows the government to make the argument, make the political pitch that they're on the side of consumers and that they're prepared to enforce this with, I think, more than the legislative tool that he's threatening. It's the contract. It's the ability to take the companies to court and to exact a financial penalty. But, like anything, I do think we have to wait and see how that plays out. It will probably be in the life of another government to deal with that.
Right, and we know that affordability was a big part of the budget. The government even promising to target junk fees like telecom roaming charges. And in the few moments we have, I do want to get all of you to give me a sense of this week's budget and really what you see as the political ricochet that might happen from this budget, or maybe there won't be one at all. Bob,
I don't know if we're going to be talking about it next week, are we? I mean,
let me get you to weigh in first. What are your thoughts?
This is a government that likes to spend, and it continues to spend, and it's in the DNA. And at a time when they're encouraging people basically to spend more on housing, when the Bank of Canada is trying to dampen the inflationary pressures. But what they've done in terms of encouraging people to buy homes is simply going to spike the housing market. And also all the the green technology stuff, you have to be careful with some of that because, it's hard for governments to pick winners and losers. And often what ends up happening is that taxpayers lose a lot of money and people walk away with the money, but they don't have the jobs or the successful businesses that they think are going to come out of it.
Tonda, what's your one big takeaway from what we saw Tuesday?
Well, I think the budget's a combination of wishful thinking, that we're not going to hit a really bad recession, a mild recession only, and big ambition, which is the big play for the clean energy investment. And that depends on how much corporations are really going to invest and take it up based on a tax credit. And will that situate us to compete with the U.S.? I don't know.
Joanna, I'll turn to you. It is interesting. We do have the Prime Minister out selling the dental benefit today, but Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, also doing an 8-city tour while the House is on a break to, I guess, celebrate, I suppose would be the word, what he believes is his party's accomplishments in getting that dental plan and that GST credit in that budget. What are you looking at in the political debate here?
Yeah, the NDP is pretty happy. Pretty much everything in that confidence and supply deal is in there, save 3 things. 2 of those 3 things are mentioned in the budget. That's the anti-scab legislation and some urban Indigenous housing stuff. I know the NDP thinks not really enough, right? So they sort of see 3 outstanding things. So my question is, next year, what Liberals going to offer? Like, where does this deal evolve? What needs to come next to keep them on side? The commitment on pharmacare is very vague. The Liberals could say, we've done it. The NDP could say, yes, we agree with you. Or with the same facts before them, the NDP could say, no, you haven't, right? So I think that sort of final step and how people interpret it will be where it goes next.
You could say this budget bought them a year. It's not the budget they're taking into an election campaign.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there for this week at least. Joanna, Tonda, and Bob, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alberta's provincial election is still nearly 2 months away. Danielle Smith and the United Conservative Party will try to hold on to government against Rachel Notley and the NDP, but we've seen several new developments recently, including new allegations involving the Premier and COVID-related prosecutions. Janet Brown is an Alberta pollster and commentator. She joins me from Calgary. Janet, good to see you.
Good. Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So right after Danielle Smith became Premier last October, your polling put the NDP about 10 points ahead of the United Conservative Party. So take us through what's been happening since with the 2 parties and with the public's view of the Premier herself.
Well, we've had a wide variety of polls here in Alberta, some, divergent findings, but I have to say that's not uncommon in Alberta. There's often a lot of error in the polls. The polls are usually quite far off the actual election results. So seeing some differences in the polls is not an uncommon thing in Alberta. So I can only speak to my own polling, which proved to be pretty accurate in the last election. And so what I've been seeing in my polling is that once Danielle Smith came into power, she was able to shore up a lot of the support among traditional Conservatives that Jason Kenney has lost. But I haven't found that she's gained a lead over Rachel Notley. Rachel Notley still remains more popular in certain parts of the province. Danielle Smith is widely popular. But I would say right now it's a very close race, definitely too close to call. But I think the NDP has the upper hand right now. And that's just because Danielle Smith is a controversial leader. And even among those people who see themselves as traditional Conservatives, they have pause about her leadership and specifically her judgment.
Okay, and I do want to ask you more about Rachel Notley in just a moment, but speaking of the Premier's support, she's again under fire this week over alleged interference in the justice system over pandemic-related cases. We have 2 top ministers recently saying they're not running again. So how do you see these most recent developments factoring in the UCP campaign?
Well, let's start with the 2 cabinet ministers who aren't running again. That's Travis Taves, who ran for the leadership and came in second to Danielle Smith, and Sonia Savage. And then going back a few weeks ago, we had another minister who ran against Danielle Smith for the leadership, Razan Sani. She stepped aside. So, I don't think the turnover is beyond normal, but it's the caliber of the people that are leaving the party that sort of gives you pause. And it's the people who had put themselves forward for a leadership role in the party. So for Raja Ansani and for Travis Taves, just 6 months ago, these are people who thought that these are people who were gunning to become premier of the province. These are people who must have, in their imaginations, had a very long runway in politics. Now they want to be out of politics. So, I think it says something to the fact that they're wondering if this government, if this party is a place where they can feel comfortable. So, yes, I think it's a blow to Danielle Smith that she's lost some of these ministers. At the same time, I should be careful to say the amount of turnover we've seen so far is not outside of the range of normal.
Okay, and once again, we have these latest allegations that I just mentioned involving Danielle Smith and COVID-19. Does bringing that back up into the news agenda pose a challenge for the party?
Well, one of the things so there was a tape released yesterday of a call between Premier Danielle Smith and someone who's currently facing criminal charges related to the border blockade at Coutts. So, I mean, someone who's facing serious charges. So now when it comes to COVID here in Alberta, it's been a contentious issue. Most Albertans were fine with the measures that were in place. During COVID, most people adhered to those measures. And as of today, most people would like to move beyond this and sort of stop seeing it as a divisive issue. So, really, for most Albertans, it's not that this call was about COVID. I think what most people have to ask themselves is, why would the Premier be speaking to somebody who was facing criminal charges? It's a very odd thing for a Premier to do. Why would she do it? Why would her staff let her do it? The common refrain of politicians is, I'm sorry, it's before the courts, I can't comment on it. Rather than do that, she decided to humor him, to say that she admired his advocacy work, that she was on his side, that she was hoping for a specific result in a criminal case. This is, as I said, it comes down to judgment, and that's the thing that Albertans who tend to be comfortable voting for conservative parties, they have to ask themselves: does this conservative leader have the judgment that I think the province needs going forward?
All right. Well, we'll certainly be watching the campaign. It's going to be a fascinating spring in the province of Alberta. Janet Brown, thanks for your insight.
Thank you very much.
The formal surrender, arrest, and arraignment of Donald Trump is expected next Tuesday, the first former president to face major criminal charges. Let's get the latest from Dave Leventhal, the editor-in-chief of Raw Story. He's joining me now. Dave, good to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So what do we know about the charges against Mr. Trump, and what comes next over the next few days?
So as of this moment, we do not know the specific charges, but what we do know is that they are related to the 2016 Donald Trump first presidency run payment that was made, effectively hush money, to porn star Stormy Daniels. In essence, this is a campaign finance related case, but it's likely to go well beyond that too. It wouldn't be surprising at all if we are talking about multiple counts of business financial forgery, falsified records. There's a lot that prosecutors have looked into, and ultimately when this indictment, now that it has come down, turns into specific charges, don't be surprised if you find any of those things that are ultimately dogging Donald Trump going forward.
Right, so we're awaiting some of those legal specifics, but of course this is happening against a big political backdrop, the next presidential campaign. So how is this indictment already playing out within the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, so Donald Trump probably on Tuesday, that could change, but likely on Tuesday, is going to surrender to authorities. He will be booked. He will be photographed. There will be a mugshot. We don't know exactly how this drama is going to play out live on the street, whether Donald Trump will walk in or be inside some sort of dark tinted window vehicle. So it remains to be seen exactly how that's going to play out. But from a political standpoint, Donald Trump is going to continue to run for president. He's going to try to use this, as he has all along, to his great advantage. And at least in the early offing here, his supporters are loving it, saying, bring it. This is a witch hunt. This is something where they're trying to take Donald Trump down, that this is Democrats and liberals and Antifa, use whatever boogeyman you want to. They're saying, Donald Trump supporters, that this is just proof. This is almost final proof that everyone is out to get Donald Trump. So short term, this is going to boost Donald Trump. The question really is, what's going to happen 3 months from now, 6 months from now? This is an indictment. There's a criminal case. A lot's going to change.
Right. Well, we know at least next week our attention will be focused on Manhattan and the former president, Dave Leventhal. Thanks so much for this.
Hey, my pleasure.
Federal nomination races can be tense at times, but the Conservative campaign for an upcoming by-election has been especially divisive, culminating in top riding officials quitting the board in Oxford, Ontario. Ian Bailey is a reporter with the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau. He's been following this story and joins me now. Ian, good to see you.
Good to be here.
So take us through this story. We have the president and vice president of the Oxford Conservatives resigning their positions. They're accusing party heavyweights of essentially hijacking the nomination in that riding. What's going on here?
There are suggestions that there was a preference in this process to nominate a candidate who was supported by former party leader Andrew Scheer and now the House leader Andrew Scheer for the Conservatives, as well as supported by Pierre Poilievre, Arpen Kana, a lawyer. And that has left some bruised feelings in the riding association among local Conservatives. A candidate, Gerard Van Dorland, who was removed from the race for not providing information to the party that was said, and that upset the anti-abortion movement in Canada, Campaign Life and the Right Now movement, because he was removed. So that kind of stirred things up. And then the recent outcome that saw Mr. Kana become the nominee has riled things up, prompted the exit of these party officials, and the suggestion that Conservatives in that riding some are left rather angry that saying that the party brass manipulated the outcome of this process.
So let's get into some of those specifics about Mr. Kana's nomination. What exactly are the criticisms that some of these local Conservatives are saying about how this process has unfolded over the last 2 months?
There being well, first off, there are being concerns about Mr. Van Dorland being disqualified from the race, the sense that he would have been a competitive candidate but was disqualified. There being concerns about the confidentiality and some of the things that the local association had to do to sort of manage the process here. And there's been overall this sense that there have been concerns about some memberships as well, and there have been concerns that the thumbs were put on the scales for Mr. Kana in general to bring about this outcome.
So we've got these local officials leveling some pretty big allegations.
Yes.
There's some angry language in the letters that we've seen in your reporting and elsewhere. What is the Conservative Party of Canada itself, the headquarters, saying in response to all this?
Reached out to the Conservatives, and a statement from the party said that Mr. Kana won fair and square, and that's it. Moving on, basically, as that he will be the nominee in this race. There's been no detailed discussion on some of the allegations that were raised in this matter.
And so, we're looking at Oxford, Ontario. This has traditionally been a pretty safe Conservative riding since the party was created 20 years ago. But I'm wondering if we can end on this. As you look at this story, we are more than 6 months into Pierre Poilievre's leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. As you follow the party, what do you think this says about how Mr. Poilievre and his team are managing the party, managing different factions within the party as we not just organize for by-elections, but also look ahead to whenever the next general election is going to be taking place?
Well, it's clear that the anti-abortion movement, the social conservative movement in the party, is on alert over this issue, and will be watching to see how Mr. Poilievre deals with them going forward because of what has happened in Oxford. They have been explicit about this. One would assume that Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Scheer wanted Mr. Kana in the House, on the team. He was involved in Mr. Poilievre's Ontario leadership campaign, involved now as the party's outreach director. So he's probably a candidate they want in. And it remains to be seen whether this is going to linger as a problem for Mr. Poilievre, as a problem in Ottawa going forward, and whether people in the riding, some of these Conservatives, are going to take further steps to express their concerns about the way this played out.
All right, well, we're actually still waiting for the by-election itself to be called in Oxford.
Exactly.
So we'll see how it all plays out. Ian Bailey, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
And that is this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Andrew Thompson. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.